Hey everyone, Kathy the Vegan Prepper here, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about impending food shortages on the horizon, specifically in wheat, corn, and rice. What are my plans in each of those areas? Some of my thought process behind that, forms of each of those foods that you may or may not be able to stock up on long term. And just so that you know, everything that I'm going to be talking about is going to be clearly marked in chapters below. You can check it out. If you don't have the time or the desire to watch the entire video, you can watch which segment matters to you the most. But now, I guess after my cute little theme song, we're gonna go ahead and get right into it. Do-do-do, do-do-do, vegan prepper. Do-do-do, do-do-do, vegan prepper. My number one tip is to focus primarily on foods that have a really long shelf life. You can get yourself a book like this one, which is my personal favorite. I reference it all of the time. I will link it down below. It has a lot of incredibly good information about food storage itself, but also which foods have the longest shelf lives. But in lieu of that, you can Google the kind of long-term prepper shelf life of any food if you put the word prepper in front of it. So if you put prepper or prepping shelf life of all-purpose flour, you will be able to pull up the information. If you try to just Google shelf life of all-purpose flour, it'll say like, you know, a year or something, because that's the shelf life that's on the bag that you get from the store. But if you want the real long-term oxygen sealed Mylar bag shelf life of almost any food, just add prepper or prepping to the front of your Google, and then you'll be able to find almost anything. But I do definitely very heartily recommend this book because it's got a lot of incredibly good information for storing it specifically, especially if you haven't ever looked into that before. But yeah, barring that, focus on what is going to last the longest, and then you will have less to think about over the course of the years that are to follow. And so next up, let's go ahead and talk about some wheat. For wheat specifically, I am personally focusing on a combination of all-purpose flour and whole wheat berries. And I think as an honorable mention, I have to mention pasta. White flour pasta has a 30-year shelf life if it's stored correctly. And so that is also a really great thing to think about to stock up on. It's a potential thing that you might not think of immediately when you think of wheat and wheat shortages and price hikes. Pasta might not be one of the first things that comes to mind, but if you love pasta in your house like we love it in our house, it's definitely something to think about. So you might want to go ahead and stock up on some pasta as well. But the all-purpose flour has a shelf life of about 10 years. Whole wheat berries have a shelf life of 30 years or more. All of this, again, if they're stored correctly. And so for me personally, I do have a grain grinder. I actually have two. I have two grain mills. One is manual that can work without electricity, and then the other one is an electric one, which is the one that I honestly use the most, of course, because it's a lot less work. But I do know how to use my manual grain grinder or grain mill. And I do definitely, for me personally, I feel like, especially if you're going to be focusing a lot on dry bulk goods, which is what I do, because it just seems to make the most sense. It takes up less space, I think, than a lot of other options. And then just in general, I think the grain mill really opens up options in your food storage, like, for instance, being able to stock up on the whole wheat berries and grind my own whole wheat flour, because whole wheat flour in and of itself, when you buy it from the store, has a very short shelf life, usually of about 6 months to a year. So I'm definitely not here trying to sell a grain mill to anybody. It's just something to think about. If you can look at grain mills and crunch some numbers. So I personally have a Nutrimill, I think, Harvest style. It's really pretty. And that's the reason I bought that one, because it's pretty. But it does get really good reviews. People also really love the Mockmill. My manual one is a Country Living grain mill, which I also just absolutely adore. But again, it's manual, it's more work. And so there's a lot of options out there. So you can probably find one that would be a pretty good price point, but let me mention some prices here. So for instance, all-purpose flour right now, I'm sourcing that from Costco. I can get about 20 pounds of organic all-purpose flour for $17. And then hard red wheat currently, as of mid-August 2023, on Azure Standard, it's running about $25 for 25 pounds. And so you can see that you can actually end up probably spending a lot less than you think stocking up on certain things. And so if you can crunch some numbers, you might find that buying a grain mill will actually end up in the long run saving you a lot of money. And I really believe that it has for me too. So that's just a thought. If not, then focus on the all-purpose flour and focus on the white pasta. And then also whole wheat berries can just be cooked and eaten almost like barley. But anyway, it's just something to keep in mind. So I think that will cover it for now for the wheat, and we can go ahead and move on to the corn. In my corn, what I'm focusing on specifically is whole corn and popcorn. So whole corn would be kind of a flatter corn kernel. Usually yellow, white, or blue is typically what you'll see when you go to try to purchase it in a large amount. And then popcorn is separate from the whole corn. Popcorn is obviously, it makes popcorn, and that is not the corn that you would grind up to make cornmeal. You need the other type of corn to make cornmeal. Since I mentioned cornmeal, I'll go ahead and say cornmeal itself has a decent shelf life. So if you don't have a grinder and you just want to store up on cornmeal, it's not necessarily a bad option. It has the same shelf life as the all-purpose flour, about 10 years if it's stored correctly. Mylar bag, oxygen absorber, away from light and heat and moisture and all of that stuff. The whole corn, I will give you some prices since we were kind of already talking about it. Currently on Azure Standard, blue corn and white corn, 25 pounds, will run you about $22.68. It's a lot of food. It's a lot of corn. It'll last you a really long time probably. So that is just another great thing. And then you just grind it up in your grinder and you have cornmeal. The popcorn currently is about $30 for 25 pounds. And so that's a little bit pricier, but it makes a ton of food. That popcorn turns into a ton of food. Not necessarily calorically, but just, you know, volume wise. And so that's another really great option. If you like popcorn, you like cooking it on the stove like we do, that's, you know, a really great option. And again, the cornmeal is not too shabby as far as the shelf life, and you may like to focus on that instead if you don't have a grinder. The one thing that I would like to mention is something that makes me extremely sad is that masa harina, which is the amazing corn flour that is used to make tamales and corn tortillas, that is not something at all that you can stock up on for any kind of long-term storage. Unfortunately, it is extremely perishable. Once the corn goes through the nixtamalization process, which is it gets cooked up with lime, not like lime juice, the lime, the powder, the chemical. I'll put it on the screen because I can't remember what the chemical name is. But once it gets cooked up with that, it goes through that process. Unfortunately, the shelf life drastically decreases. And so you're looking at maybe 6 months for your masa harina. And so that is another thing to potentially look into if you're really into making tamales or corn tortillas and you want to do all of that. Go ahead and look into potentially the nixtamalization process. I personally have lime on hand for making my own masa harina. I have not done that yet, but even if you're not turning your corn flour into, or your cornmeal into masa harina, it's a really great idea to have that lime on hand anyway, so that you can do the process, because not only does cooking the corn with lime make it so that it makes more flexible tortillas and more, yummy stuff that you can eat with it, it makes it so that it unlocks the nutrition that's available in corn so much more. And so you can really maximize the nutrition that's locked up inside the corn kernel if you go through the nixtamalization process. And so that's a great thing to look up. Rose Red, is it Rose Red Homestead? No, it's not Rose Red Homestead. Anyway, it's a channel that's amazing. She has an entire series on nixtamalization, and I will link it down below for you to check that out. But like I said, unfortunately, masa harina is not long-term storage, but you can make preparations to make your own masa harina if you're super interested in that, if you like to make tamales and tortillas like we do. So anyway, now we'll move on to the rice. So for rice specifically, I am personally stocking up on white rice. White rice, if it's stored correctly, has a shelf life of about 30 years. It's also by far the cheapest thing that I have access to in this whole list. I get 25-pound bags of white rice from Costco currently for about $12. Now that's non-organic, and so if you really insist on organic, obviously you will pay more, but we're just talking about plain, regular, long grain brown rice, no like fancy jasmine or basmati or any of that, just straight up rice from Costco, about $12 for 25 pounds. And that is what I currently get. I think that if you're willing to buy the 50-pound bag, it's even cheaper, but I honestly don't have a space left in my storage for any more 50-pound bags. And so I've been focusing a lot more on 25-pound bags. And then the other thing is brown rice. Granted, it has more nutrition and that's totally fine. But it has a shelf life of anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So it's not like it goes bad really fast, but I will tell you personally, I no longer trust brown rice. So in all of the time that I have been doing this, I have had bugs in 2 items, or twice. I have had bugs twice. And both times, guess what? The bugs were in. You probably can guess. It was the brown rice. Twice. I got bugs in brown rice. Twice. I don't even have a big bucket. I have a small bucket because I don't tend to buy a ton of it at once. We don't honestly use a lot of brown rice. Honestly, if I'm using a whole grain, because like I don't want to use white rice and I'm going for a whole grain, I personally tend to go for quinoa. Quinoa has a shelf life of about 20 years. And so I personally switch over to that one also because it has the same cooking time as rice. It cooks in about 20 minutes and I'm usually in a rush. That's usually why I'm not using brown rice, is because I'm in a rush, not so much because I don't like it. I actually really like the taste of brown rice, but like I said, I no longer trust it because both of the times I've had bugs in my food storage, it was in the brown rice. Thankfully, it was in a sealed bucket, one of the smaller 2-gallon buckets that I have, and I didn't end up with bugs anywhere else. But I just thought I would share that. But if you want to store brown rice, go right ahead, and I wish you success. But yeah, I'm focusing on the white rice. All right, bonus segment, I gotta mention my beans, okay? Beans and lentils, they typically have a shelf life of about 30 years. Again, stored correctly, blah, blah, blah. And so they also are ridiculously versatile. And so for instance, if you can't use wheat because you are gluten intolerant, or say you have celiac disease, or somebody in your family does, or something like that, beans are actually a great thing to get because you can approximate a lot of wheat type foods, muffins and pancakes and flatbreads and all kinds of stuff using ground up beans, specifically chickpeas. Chickpea flour, I have a chickpea flour cookbook. The entire cookbook is chickpea flour. I can link that down below. It's not entirely vegan, but every recipe does have vegan options. And so you can check that down below. So if you have some chickpeas and a grain grinder, you can go ahead and make yourself some chickpea flour and make like all kinds of stuff kind of in perpetuity. And so same thing with like lentils. You don't, like red lentils specifically, you don't necessarily need a grain mill for that. You could, if you just have a blender, sort of soak stuff overnight, blend it up, you can make yourself flatbreads and all kinds of stuff like with red lentils, an approximation of tofu, just, yeah, so many things that you can do with beans. Hopefully, if you just didn't know that beans could be more than just beans, let me know in the comments down below. Actually, I would love to know if you didn't know that. Look up some options. Indian cuisine specifically has a ton of bread-like items that they make with various bean flours instead. If you've ever enjoyed a dosa, like that giant pancake, this little filling or whatever, that is made of lentil flour. It's usually like fermented lentil flour. They make dosas out of it. It's so good. And there's just so many options, like I said. So look into the world of beans as far as options of things that you could make, whether you have your grain mill or you have a blender. There's like even mung beans, for instance. You could soak those and blend those up and do all kinds of stuff with mung beans. Yeah, just a lot of possibilities there. And so I wanted to mention beans, just in case you hadn't thought about it or just didn't even know that you could do things with beans that are not just beans. I will also link below a couple of videos, I think from Provident Prepper, where they were cooking some really old beans to sort of methods that they used to make the beans soft and good again. Excellent videos with all kinds of options, things that worked as well, things that didn't work as well, so that you can kind of plan for yourself how you might cook some of those beans if you end up with some really old beans that are not going soft very well. But that's another really great place where a grain mill could come in to be able to grind up really old beans, make more of a flour. You could stir it in a pot, you know, usually cook for 5 or 7 minutes with some water, and then end up with you know, like a bean, like almost like a refried bean consistency type thing. That is actually something that some people do. They grind pinto beans into flour and you cook it on the stovetop with water. Usually 5 to 7 minutes, you'll end up with something like a refried bean. And so that's actually a really great idea. It lowers the cooking time, lessens the amount of power that you need or the amount of fuel that you might need to cook something like that. Obviously, beans normally take a really long time to cook, but having a grain mill also potentially opens up beans specifically as something that you can cook in a very short amount of time. And again, if you do not have a grain mill, then any kind of split beans or like red lentils specifically have a very short cooking time, usually anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. Compared to other beans, obviously that's a really short cooking time. So there's a lot of things to consider with beans. I could wax eloquent about beans all day long, but I won't. I will cut this off and just hopefully get your mind stirring a little bit about the possibilities of what you could do with a lot of storage of dried beans. Hopefully that was helpful to you in any way. Hopefully you learned something new. If you have any thoughts or ideas or things that I did not say, please put them down in the comments below so that we can get even more information attached to this video, because I only know as much as I know. And so I'm really grateful to have additional input from other people. I think it just helps enrich everything. So I love hearing what other people have to say. Share your knowledge, share your expertise, your experience. And I would love that. I'd love for other people to benefit from that. And yeah, I hope that that basically covers it. Hopefully you feel a little calmer. If you've been stressed about the coming food shortages and things like that, hopefully you got some ideas of places where you can kind of focus and not get too overwhelmed in those categories. And hopefully you got some good information. Like I said, this is an insanely good book for learning how to store food properly if you haven't done that before. Again, that's linked down below. And yeah, I think I'm gonna go ahead and leave you, and hopefully you feel a little better than you did when you started watching the video. If you were stressed, hopefully you're a little less stressed. Hopefully you got something out of that. Hopefully you even enjoyed it a little bit. And as always, I hope the rest of your day is good and your life stays wonderful. Thank you so much for watching. See you guys in the next one. Bye.